Hello and welcome to the Hidebound Convivium. I know you probably wouldn't have guessed it because I'm just so full of youthful vigor and, well, let's be honest, I look 12. You wouldn't know it just to look at me, but I'm actually a junior in college. And I wanted to share with you guys one of my sophomore papers that I wrote for an essay class over the topic of school shootings and gun control. I think the issue of school shootings has been, obviously it's been really big for the last couple weeks because of, first you had the Parkland shooting, and more recently you had the Santa Fe high school shooting. And I think the media hysteria and the paranoia that has been fed by all this is due in a large part to the public and media unwillingness to accept that evil things happen, that evil people exist, and that bad things are just going to happen, and that some things are unavoidable. So in this essay, I took the stance that school shootings are, at least in the United States, completely unavoidable. Because even if you took the most stringent gun control measures right this second, there would still be ways for, disturbed or frankly morally compromised teenagers to get their hands on firearms and take them into schools that are obviously very soft targets. So anyway, the essay, I'm about to read it, and it just covers those sorts of issues. And I actually do want your feedback on this one. And I'm probably going to skip over the in-text citations, but I will take all of the citations out of the Works Cited page and put those on the in the description. I'm going to be honest, I was a little lazy with the sources, so I mostly got sources citing other sources. So I would, click through and go through there. But anyway, so I'm going to read it, and that'll be all. Thank you for watching. All right, so after the Parkland massacre, in which 17 students were gunned down by a fellow pupil, the United States seems to be in an uproar. It is the kind of uproar that is brought on by fear, two kinds of fear specifically: the fear brought on by vulnerability and the fear of being made vulnerable. Since 9/11, acts of violence on U.S. soil seem to have ceased to carry the kind of weight that they once exerted on the American psyche. Attacks against the public are nothing new in the age of terror, as the 20th century can attest. The 60s and 70s were a notoriously bloody time, with lynch mobs terrorizing civil rights advocates in the South and Marxists bombing banks and government buildings. Yet after 9/11, we have become normalized to acts of extreme violence perpetrated on U.S. soil, not desensitized entirely, but acclimatized. Even given a certain level of normalization, school shootings prove to be a more frightening phenomenon given their randomness and the victims involved. While the Columbine shooting popularized the idea of the school shooting in the 90s, the 2010s appear to be the golden age of the school shooting so far. The deadliness and randomness of school shootings is theorized to spring from several different causes, notably easy access to firearms of certain types, prevalence of mental health problems and intervention by law enforcement, and the vulnerability of schools themselves. Each of these causes is attendant with its own logical solution, and each is plagued with a plethora of problems. The first and most prevalent of the proposed causes for mass shootings is the easy availability of firearms, or more precisely, assault weapons. There are several reasons why recent pushes for gun restrictions could lead to an unintended suppression of civil liberties. Most glaringly, there is, to this day, very little agreement on what constitutes an assault rifle. Some of the general attributes of a weapon that is popularly deemed to be an assault or assault-style weapon are that it is a long gun with a pistol grip, black gunmetal stock instead of a more standard wooden stock, a magazine-fed semi-automatic action, and has tactical attachments such as a sight rail. It is worth pointing out that none of the above-mentioned qualities have any effect on a weapon's actual rate of fire or the damage dealt. Needless to say, a lack of clarity around what constitutes an assault rifle makes it difficult to carve out a class of firearms that can be legally banned. In a recent CNN town hall discussion about possible new gun control measures, Senator Marco Rubio noted in reference to the Clinton-era gun control legislation that, and it's just Marco Rubio whinging about guns. Anyway, to have a brief sidebar, I watched the CNN town hall, and it was a bloodbath. I really applaud Marco Rubio for volunteering for that. Anyway, so the law that he refers to in the quote I gave is the Federal Assault Weapons Ban of 1994, a piece of legislation aimed at curtailing gun violence. The effectiveness of the gun ban is widely disputed, but some studies have claimed it to have little to no effect. It bans certain types of semi-automatic firearms, namely military-style rifles such as the AK-47 with large-capacity magazines, and it cites Wellford, Pepper, and Petrie. The poster child of the debate against assault weapons, the AR-15, which stands for Armalite Rifle, not Assault Rifle, is an old rifle pattern that was commissioned by the Army from Colt and entered service during the Vietnam War, citing Gibbons Neff. Because patents have expired, almost every major firearms company manufactures its own version of the AR-15, which is chambered in most conceivable calibers, but as Gibbons Neff correctly states in his article for the Washington Post, the AR-15 has traditionally been chambered in .223. It is worth noting that this is a relatively small cartridge, giving the rifle much less stopping power than the earlier firearms such as the M1 Garand, which was the standard issue service rifle of U.S. forces during the Second World War and is chambered in .30-06. In recent years, much ado has been made of the aftermarket modifications that are often attached to these types of modular rifles by enthusiasts such as bump stocks, which allow the shooter to achieve rates of fire similar to automatic weapons. A bump stock works by essentially transferring the force of the recoil into the shooter's shoulder and back into the stock, which propels the rifle forward and the trigger forward into the shooter's trigger finger. The Trump administration and congressional leaders, for example, have discussed the outright ban of the aforementioned bump stocks, and in some instances, officials have pushed for reassertion of a ban on high-capacity magazines. Recent legislation in Florida has sought to implement some of these fixes. Leaving aside the assault weapons debate, there are other points of contention over firearm availability. The infamous quote-unquote gun show loophole is purported to allow firearm purchase without a background check, and some gun merchants are undoubtedly guilty of failing to do proper diligence when selling weapons. That is saying nothing of the prevalence of black market or resold firearms. Some estimates have shown that between 270 and 310 million guns are owned by civilians in the United States. And furthermore, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms reports that around 2.5 million firearms were registered with them through the National Firearms Act, which represents an increase of over 1 million applicants as compared to 2015. This means that any attempt at confiscation or buyback program akin to that of Australia's would almost certainly be doomed to fail just due to the fact of the sheer number of firearms in circulation. Well, I lost my place. And the undoubtedly large black market for which we have no formal records. But that only begins to explain why a direct confiscation would not be feasible. Never mind that it is widely thought by many in the population to be a trampling of civil liberties and a constitutional violation. But firearm availability is only one part of the equation that goes into these deadly shootings. The Old State Psychiatric Hospital in Bolivar, Tennessee stands out to me as a fairly iconic facade, because my grandfather worked there in the 70s, but also because of the reputation such institutions carry. As Richard Lyons of the New York Times pointed out in his article, How the Release of Mental Patients Began, the cat's on the windowsill. A concerted effort by budget-minded politicians, lobbyists, and psychiatrists armed with misleading case studies set out to deinstitutionalize mental health care for the good of the taxpayer and the mentally ill, who by the 60s and 70s were thought to be horribly mistreated by the institutions that had been charged with their care. While it is no secret that mental health institutions did indeed have a deserved reputation for cruelty, what followed could be considered a disaster in regard to public policy towards the mentally ill. Many patients released from institutions were never and could never be rehabilitated and absorbed into society. And today, over 8 million Americans are considered mentally ill. but the capacity of mental hospitals in 2010 was only 50,000 beds a year. Additionally, Lyons attributes this move to deinstitutionalization to an over-reliance on drugs, which allowed for the possibility of mentally ill persons medicating themselves out of the need for constant psychiatric care, an attitude that is still prevalent today. This has had a profound effect on our mentally ill population. In 1880, 0.7% of the prison population had a mental illness. That number in 2005 was 21%. The lack of available space in state mental hospitals is troubling, and private hospitals rarely take insurance and can cost upwards of $3,000 a month. All of these factors combined paint a bleak picture for those who genuinely need round-the-clock psychiatric assistance. Now, I'm going to concede the point that a lot of the increase in rate of mental illness is due to a lot more diagnoses, because there are a lot more mental illnesses that have been invented or discovered since 1880, but 21% is still a marked increase, even when you account for that. School shooters themselves have very often been speculated by the media or politicians to have been mentally ill. Part of this, I believe, is a natural unwillingness to accept the nature of evil as it can manifest in wholly rational people. But in the case of the Parkland shooter, there is little doubt that he was disturbed, and multiple outlets have reported on constant calls of neighbors and people who knew the young man to the authorities describing him as potentially unstable. This raises two problems, however. On the one hand, this attitude can lead to stigmatization of the mentally ill as especially violent when that is not the case. But more importantly, it leads the way to a sort of minority report system of shooter prevention. It is often argued that, had authorities intervened to stop Mr. Cruz, the Parkland shooting would not have happened. Let us assume this to be the case. Does this not logically follow that those suspected of being violently psychologically disturbed can be detained and presumably placed against their will in a mental hospital by the authorities on the grounds of neighborly suspicion? In the event that such an individual truly is emotionally disturbed and does not want to harm others, I find this an acceptable scenario, but I cannot help but wonder what antisocial behaviors, what telltale signs will get one marked as a potential school shooter. We have yet to grapple with the concerns of forcibly committing individuals to psychiatric care, which is not totally dissimilar to incarceration without them having committed a crime. One of the dangers of this system is precisely that it has the potential to stretch our constitutional right to due process to its most elastic extreme, the shadows of which are already being seen with President Trump's absurd and dangerous remarks that they would, quote, take the guns, worry about due process later, end quote. The final point in the school shooting drama, and the one that is more or less unique to public schools, is that they are remarkably soft targets. There is no doubt that schools appear to be the favored targets for potential shooters, and a variety of reasons are proposed. On the one hand, conservatives will normally argue that shooters know they will be successful because a school is, by the nature of the thing, free of people with firearms, save perhaps a school resource officer if there is one. Those on the other side of the aisle tend to emphasize the fact that schools are a target-rich environment, and that school shooters tend to be present or former students. Unfortunately, it's hard to get good data on just why these gunmen choose to target schools because, frankly, they usually end up dead in the process of committing their shooting spree. The different functions that the camps see as motivating factors for the shooters to choose schools seem to be driving policy. Conservatives generally are pushing for more school security, armed security generally. Liberals, by contrast, continue to push bans on weapons most often used by the offenders, some type of tactical rifle like the AR-15, while it is unlikely that the latter approach will have much effect, as I have argued above. The former approach is not without its own problems, namely the massive public expenditure involved, as well as the psychological effect on high school-age students of being guarded by a small army. Taking all the above-mentioned proposed solutions and the threats that they have to potential, dear Lord, and the threats that they have a potential to pose to civil liberties, we are often left wondering if any solution is possible. While some methods may be more effective than others at curtailing mass shootings, we still don't understand the root cause of the problem. It isn't AR-15s, it can't be mental health in every case, and it's not just because schools are vulnerable. What is the real motivator or motivators of the gunmen at Parkland and Sandy Hook and Columbine? I cannot truly say, But I do know that the chances of attaining a situation of zero mass shootings in the United States is utterly unachievable through legalistic means, unless, that is, we put ourselves dangerously close to willingly abandoning constitutional rights to bear arms and due process, or are content with a disquieting militarization of our schools. I do not have the solutions to school shootings on hand because there is no workable solution that would give us what politicians are promising without forfeiting our rights. I do know that the proposed solutions I have laid out have the potential to violate some of our most sacred liberties. All right, that was my essay on gun policy. So, like I said, the sources will be in the description, and thank you for watching.